Now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Steve Hoogerwerf. Steve is a senior research professor and an associate professor of religion emeritus at Hope College, his undergraduate alma mater. He has a master's in divinity from Western Theological Seminary and a PhD in theology and ethics from Duke University, and he's also a HAS member. Just to let you know, Steve has to leave immediately, or promptly, I should say. So if you questions are lingering, he'll be back next week, of course, and there'll be plenty of time to ask questions and also talk to him after the class next week. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Kathy. So the title of the whole course is The Problem of Evil and Human Suffering. Today, I'm going to focus on the problem of evil. And next time, we're going to focus on how is God at work in the world. So a little backwards in terms of the order. So today, we're going to explore the problem of evil as it's understood in the Christian tradition. And we're going to look at some ways Christians have typically responded to the problem of evil in what I call comfort phrases. You probably all use comfort phrases. I'm going to be pretty critical of them, so kind of stick with me for a bit. Maybe, and at the end, I'm going to give you a chance to say, I use that comfort phrase you criticize, and I think it's a really good idea to use it. And so you can disagree with me about the value of comfort phrases. But I'll be pretty harsh, perhaps on your favorite one. So first of all, what kind of problem is the problem of evil? Three answers to that. First of all, a specific example. This comes from a tragic accident on Hope's campus last year. And I'm going to read to you an email that I received as a member of the Hope community. And the email said this: earlier this evening, we lost one of our own students in an unimaginable accident. Jennifer Kasunik was struck by a train near 10th Street and did not survive. Hearing this news will raise many questions, and I don't have answers. I don't know why God would allow this to happen. So the problem of evil in this email is it's implied that the problem is that a good God allowed a terrible accident to happen. Now, previewing today's session, I have some questions about that comment. And they're kind of open questions. For example, did God choose to have that accident happen? If God chose it, could God have chosen not to allow it to happen? What kind of control does God have over events like this, which we might call accidents? Are they really accidents? And I don't know why God would allow this to happen. What if we did know why somehow? Would that change things much? Would we say, oh, I guess it's okay then because God chose to allow it for a good reason? So a set of questions around a very common thing that people say in the face of a terrible tragedy. The second, my second answer to the question, what kind of problem is the problem of evil, would go like this. I think it's a concrete, existential problem that has real impact on people's lives because the problem has real impact in the world. For example, war raises questions about the problem of evil, abuse, environmental degradation, injustice, disease, untimely death. The problem of evil arises in the midst of real life occurrences that usually cause us to ask really hard questions about it, things we witness or experience ourselves, about things that usually cause people deep emotional pain that we call suffering. So that's one answer to the question, what kind of problem is it? And the third kind of problem is it's an intellectual challenge. And it's a challenge that can make Christians Well, let's start here. It's a challenge that can make Christian faith look untenable to outsiders. If you'd ask somebody, like, why aren't you Christian? They might say, well, like, I can't imagine how a good God could allow all this evil to happen. So Christianity doesn't make sense to me. But when Christians experience tragedy, it also creates that intellectual challenge for Christians sometime. They might ask, how can I go on trusting in God when things no longer make sense? Or in light of all the evil and suffering in the world throughout human history, how can this world be the creation of a good and all-powerful God? Or in a world governed by a good and all-powerful God, why is there so much evil and suffering? So that's another way it's a problem. Now, very quickly, I'm just going to give you a personal example of how this became a problem for me, probably in the first time in my life. My mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer at the age of 45. It was the very end of my senior year in high school. So I encountered this problem of evil when I was about 17 years old. We belonged to a Reformed Church in America congregation in Grand Rapids, and a whole church full of people were praying for her. And she died 6 months later, at the very end of my first semester as a Hope College student. It seemed to me that my whole world had been turned upside down. And when I stopped to think about it in terms of these problem of evil questions, it also seemed like my faith had been turned upside down, especially at that time, my faith in prayer. So, challenged by my own experience of the problem of evil, I spent a lot of my time at Hope College trying to figure this out. I was a religion major and a philosophy major, and I was trying to put my faith back together. Okay, now just a couple important definitions. What do I mean by evil? Now, there could be a lot of definitions. So I'm going to tell you what I mean by it in this presentation. And first of all, I need to distinguish two kinds of evil: moral evil and natural evil. So moral evil describes usually actions that people engage in that we would call morally bad, intrinsically corrupt, inhumane, selfish, unjust. Lots of other words to use to define evil that way. Evil describes acts, thoughts, and ideas which typically are thought to bring about pain and suffering and death and destruction. Evil, in a sense, causes great harm and is contrary to the will of God. Moral evil includes individual actions, but it also includes systemic evil. For example, humans build evil sometimes into social systems. Slavery would be an example of that. So that's moral evil, right? It occurs as a result of the moral agency people have to do evil. Natural evil is a little different. Natural evil are events in nature that cause destruction, pain, or suffering. Now, we don't usually think about nature as having moral agency like moral evil, but nature has the power to wreak havoc on a very large scale, causing unimaginable pain and suffering. We all see these things in the news from time to time. Wildfires that destroy huge neighborhoods, and right, everyone's homes are in ruin. Earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, hurricanes, disease. Right? These are examples of suffering caused by nature. Not again because nature has moral agency like people do, but it has the power to do great evil. So again, these definitions might vary from person to person, but when I'm talking about evil, I just want you to understand what I'm meaning by it here. Evil, in the problem of evil is generally understood as a logical dilemma. Let me explain what that means and what the dilemma is and how it works. Philosopher John Hick, who's an English philosopher of religion, he died in 2012, much published. John Hick presents the logical dilemma in these words. You know what? I never use a PowerPoint when I'm teaching at Hope College, but I have one and I've not used it yet. So, and you didn't need it, did you? So maybe I should just leave it off. But I want you to see John Hick's problem of evil. John Hicks said, the dilemma goes like this. If God is perfectly good, God must want to abolish evil. And if God is unlimitedly powerful, God must be able to abolish evil. But evil exists. Therefore, God either is not perfectly good or is not unlimitedly powerful. Right? And that's a dilemma because from the Christian perspective, we wouldn't want to draw this conclusion, probably, or Christians wouldn't want to draw this conclusion. So there's a very simple way to summarize the dilemma, and then I'm going to explain again how it's really a dilemma, because sometimes people don't see it. So in a very simple form, the dilemma is God's good, God's all-powerful, evil exists. You can get rid of any one of those, and you no longer have a dilemma. But the problem is, in the Christian tradition, it's hard to get rid of any one of them. Let me explain what I mean by how you could get rid of any one of them. Let's imagine, for example, that God isn't good. God doesn't care what happens to people. Maybe the world to God is like a giant video game, and God enjoys actually watching all the suffering that's going on. If that was true, we'd no longer have a dilemma. Then we'd have an all-powerful God who maybe designed this horrible video game, and we'd have a lot of evil. But we wouldn't have a dilemma because we'd understand why there's so much evil. Or let's say God isn't all-powerful. Maybe God has some power, but God can't control everything. So if I'm suffering and I throw up my hands to God and say, God, please look on my suffering and help me. Please do something about it. Please deliver me from my suffering. You might imagine if God's not all powerful, that God would say to me, well, Steve, I see how you're suffering. It troubles me deeply. I wish it wasn't the case, but what do you expect me to do about it? I'm only God. So if God isn't in control, if God's power doesn't extend that far, we've solved the dilemma, right? God's good, caring, loving, kind, just, but can't actually make those good things happen. So sometimes evil exists. Right? Again, easy solution if you're willing to give up those claims. You could also get rid of the claim that evil exists. That's probably the most common response that Christians end up giving without actually saying that evil doesn't exist. And I'll show you how that's the case in a lot of what I call comfort phrases. So Christian responses to the problem of evil are generally called theodicies, right? It's kind of a nice theological term you can take home with you. Theo, God, the DC is a version of the Greek word defense. So a theodicy is a defense of God, and especially a defense of a good and all-powerful God in a world where evil exists. And we could look at sort of kind of classic Christian theological categories of theodicies, but I think it might be more interesting to do that a different way. So we're going to look at what I call comfort phrases. Let me just give you an example of what may be the most common comfort phrase. Everything happens for a reason. And I have a whole list of a whole bunch of comfort phrases. And what we find in a comfort phrase is we find a theodicy embedded there. When you say the comfort phrase, you don't necessarily know which theodicy is embedded in it, right? Because you don't necessarily think it through carefully. I'm going to sort of tease apart the logic of that phrase in just a little bit. So we're going to look at 4 categories of comfort phrases that contain 4 different categories of theodicies. And I'm going to explain what those comfort phrases say, how they try to resolve the dilemma, and why I think they're potentially problematic. But before I criticize comfort phrases, including maybe some of your favorite comfort phrases, I'm going to say a little bit about why I think people use comfort phrases in the first place. I think people use comfort phrases in ways that are well-intended. We use comfort phrases because we hope these words will touch the heart of a person who is suffering. We want to help them, right? It's words of comfort from the heart of one who cares to the heart of one who suffers. Right? So, a noble intention. Comfort phrases might also be fueled by a deeply ingrained sense that we need to create meaning when something seems meaningless. I think that's sort of built into us as humans, right? If things don't make sense, we don't just say, oh, that's okay. We try to make sense of them. That's why I think often on the news, if there's a crime like a murder, the first thing people want to do is try to figure out why someone would have done it, right? Because then it makes a little more sense than if we don't know that. So it's built into us to want to make sense of things that seem meaningless. Another reason we use comfort phrases, I think, is because they give us something to say when we don't have anything to say. Let me see if this is on. You can remind me from time to time, hey, don't forget the PowerPoint. It gives us something to say when we don't have anything to say. You've probably all been there. For example, let's say you go to a visitation at the funeral home, and the person who died was too young to die. They didn't want to die. Their loved ones didn't want to lose them. Like maybe this was a mother who died of breast cancer who still has young children at home, right? So it's a terrible situation. And you finally walk up to her, right, standing in the line in the visitation room, and you don't know what to say. So a comfort phrase might come in handy. Although maybe that's not the best thing to do. Maybe instead of a comfort phrase, you should say something like, "This is so sad. I don't know what to say." Or maybe you just don't say anything. I think when it's appropriate, a hug says a lot more than any words say, right, in a situation like this. Just being present, I think, which can be really hard, right? Sometimes you don't want to go see the person because you don't want to be put in this awkward situation of not knowing what to say. But being present, I think, is mostly what counts. Given my own personal story that I just told you a bit ago, my mother died right before exam week, and I think it might have been the week people are studying for exams when she had her visitation, and a group of people big enough to stand around me in a circle came, like students, and I can still picture that, like being that circle of close friends phrase has always meant that to me since I experienced it. So what did those people say to me? I have no idea. If you had asked me a month later, I probably couldn't have told you anything they said. But a year later, I honestly could have said who was there. I could have named every one of those people. Their being present was what mattered. What they said, if they said anything, didn't really matter at all. And finally, comfort phrases help us to restore things sort of into a meaningful framework. And they help restore what we've always been taught about God. If I don't want to question whether God's good or whether God's all powerful, I can use a comfort phrase, and that helps me, in a sense, hide from those other questions, which I don't really want to have to engage, right? Because that's way too uncomfortable. So we have a lot of good reasons for using comfort phrases. I'm going to do an analysis now of 4 categories of comfort phrases, and each category embeds a traditional Christian theodicy. And some of those theodicies get really complex. And that theodicy is often embedded in a way we don't see. And I'm going to give you some examples. So the first category of comfort phrases essentially says that God is in control. Here are some examples. It's all part of God's plan. You've heard that before? Everything happens for a reason. It was their time. So those are just sort of 3 really clear examples. Everything happens for a reason is the most common comfort phrase that I've heard. When I taught a class called Religion and Atrocity at Hope, and we looked at comfort phrases, I went through an analysis of everything happens for a reason. Before I did it, I said to students, if you want to keep using that phrase, you probably ought to leave the room for a few minutes. I'll call you back in when I'm done sort of tearing it apart. And in their final papers, when they had to respond to a specific problem of evil, many of them used everything happens for a reason as a response. It's deeply ingrained in us. So what does it mean when we say everything happens for a reason? This is just my own sense of teasing it apart. So I think it means, first of all, that while this event might seem meaningless or evil, it isn't. It happened for a reason, right? So it's not meaningless because everything happens for a reason. But if this is said in the Christian tradition, it probably also means that everything happened for God's reasons. I know someone who was in an automobile accident, and as a teenager, and as a result, she was paralyzed, quadriplegic. And if you asked, like, why did that happen? The answer might have been, it was a very icy evening. She was a relatively new driver, right? Given, the laws of inertia and physics, when a car hits a tree and a person, right, is smashed against it, things break. And so it kind of all makes sense. Like, why is she paralyzed? That's why. But if people say everything happens for a reason, they don't mean icy roads, usually, right? They mean it happened for a bigger reason. It happened for God's reasons. Because God is the force behind everything that happens. So if God is good, that also means that God's reasons are good. Right? So in a sense, everything happens for God's good reasons. And if that's true, then we can trust that whatever happens is in an ultimate sense good, because it happened for God's good reasons. Now, what you want to do with that is up to you, but I don't want to draw the conclusion that everything happens for God because it's God's reason, and God had a good reason for it. Lots of terrible things happen that I think God wouldn't want to happen, doesn't want to happen, and would encourage people who are followers of Jesus to try to do something about so they didn't happen. Right? So everything happens for a reason, for me, denies some of my own theological convictions. But it does solve the dilemma, right? And it solves it not by qualifying God's goodness or power, but by eliminating evil happens and replacing it with a different kind of claim. Okay, the second set of comfort phrases. And so that that little logical analysis was my critique of those kinds of comfort phrases. The second set of comfort phrases presume that when we face evil and suffering, it will in the end be good for us. Why? Because it will be an opportunity for growth, for wisdom, for compassion, for patience. And I think this probably makes sense to maybe a lot of you and to a lot of people. Why does it make sense? If I went around the room and asked each one of you to tell me about a case in which you experienced evil, right, some kind of tragedy or suffering, and then I said, is it, when you think back on that, did anything good come out of that? A lot of you would be able to say, yes, something good did come out of it. Right? So that's why these comfort phrases often make sense to people. I'll sort of clarify the problem here in the end, but here's some examples of them. Maybe God is trying to teach you a lesson. Now, this would have to be said with great gentleness, right? To be a comfort phrase. God is using this event in your life, perhaps to train you for some future task. God is like a surgeon who causes pain in order to help us. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, in case you didn't all hear that. A smooth sea never made a skilled sailor. Or from Romans 5, verses 3 to 5, it includes the phrase suffering produces endurance, right? So endurance is a kind of growth that occurs. Okay, how do these comfort phrases resolve the problem of evil? So they suggest, I think, that while an event might cause suffering, it's justified. And that's the key word. It's justified by the result. It's good because it was a means to a good end. Now, we could substitute the phrase, the end, the good end, justifies the means, the suffering. But we probably don't usually agree that the end justifies the means, right? Some means we might see as evil and unjustified, even if something good happens to come out of them at the end. So the dilemma is solved because God, an all-powerful God, allowed the evil, and then here's another key word, so that good would come about, right? So that is another replacement for it's justified by. So did God cause an accident so that good would come out of it? That again is potentially highly problematic. But these comfort phrases imply that God did cause or allow. And if you want to ask a question about the difference between cause and allow, we can talk about that after I'm done. In fact, I plan on having at least a half an hour for questions and comments and discussion. So does God cause things, bad things, or allow bad things so that good things will happen? I found philosopher Nicholas Waltersdorf's consideration of these questions very helpful. At the time Waltersdorf wrote his book, Lament for a Son, he was a philosophy professor at Calvin College. It was Calvin College then. And I think his little book, Lament for a Son, is one of the best things for people to read if they are personally suffering at the time, because it is his personal journal, which he was encouraged to publish. So you sort of walk with him through his grief in ways that help you or the reader deal with their own grief. So near the end, he deals with this question about, like, would God, and his son, who was in his early 20s, fell off a mountain while mountain climbing and was killed. So, so he's wondering about this. Does God allow bad things to happen so good things will come about? So when I read his chapter, I think it would make sense to say this about what he says. I'm not going to read a quote from him. I'm going to tell you what I think after reading that I should say to him in that circumstance. I should say something like this: your son died in a terrible accident. That should never happen to anyone. I imagine that God grieves his death along with you. Even though nothing will erase this loss, I do hope that someday you will be able to look back on this tragic event with the realization that God acted redemptively, helping you to grow in ways you might not otherwise have experienced. Waltersdorf did acknowledge that he grew in ways he wouldn't have grown otherwise because this terrible thing happened. But I think there's a really important distinction. Evil is never justified, even if something good comes out of it. Even if someone's blessed by growth in the end, it doesn't justify the evil. God doesn't allow us to suffer so that we will grow. God apparently does, however, act redemptively, helping us grow following the tragedy. So you see how that's different? The evil is still evil, and God is not in the evil, causing it, allowing it. Right? Something else is causing the evil. But when something good comes out of it, I think it makes sense, at least as I understand the Christian tradition, to say that God can help redeem evil, can bring good out of evil, even though God doesn't cause the evil so that the good will happen. So those comfort phrases that imply somehow God did it so that you grow, I find problematic. There's a third set of comfort phrases, these claim that our ability to understand evil and suffering are limited, right? And we would need to have a different perspective. And because we don't have the perspective we need, if you know the Pauline phrase, we see through a glass darkly. That's sort of the nature of things now, right? We see suffering, but we can't even begin to understand it. And if I demand it, right, we need to understand this. Someone might say to me, like, you're only human. How do you expect to understand such things? Right? God might understand it, but you're not God. So just be humble about that, right? You can't understand it. So here's some examples of comfort phrases that say this. Sort of what I just said. We can't expect with our limited perspective to see how all things will work together for good. We just need to trust that they will. We need evil in order to appreciate good. Right? That's a common claim. It takes both rain and sunshine to make a rainbow. God is weaving everything into a beautiful tapestry, which is God's grand design. And we can't see yet what that beautiful tapestry looks like, but it will ultimately be revealed. This is probably the most common form, some form of what's called the tapestry response, one of the most common forms of this particular set of comfort phrases. I wished I had a tapestry I could show you. If you look at the back side of a tapestry, often all you see are a bunch of knots and threads and no discernible pattern. It looks like a mess, right? And somehow, sometimes when you look at the world, you probably see the same thing, right? Bunch of knots and threads, what a mess. And the tapestry response says, it does look like a mess now because you're only human. You can't see God's grand design. But someday, maybe this would be in heaven or whatever, someday you'll see the other side of the tapestry and you'll say, oh, now I see how God was somehow able to weave this into a grand design that was not at all apparent when I looked at it from a human perspective. So that's another category of comfort phrases. How does it resolve the intellectual dilemma? It essentially implies that if we could see things from God's perspective, we would realize that what seems to be evil is actually the result of is actually under the control of a good God who's in full of a good God who's also in full control. Evil will fit into God's grand design, and that's why a good God allows it to happen. You might think it shouldn't happen, but we don't know how it's going to create this grand design. Okay, a few not there yet. A few critiques of this third category. For example, if you said that to me, right, it's all going to, God's weaving together a beautiful tapestry. I might wonder how you know that. How do we really know that God's weaving a tapestry? It seems to presume that you have the kind of knowledge that this argument is saying you don't have, right? You don't have the perspective to see that God's really doing that. Right? You might hope that's the case, right? And so maybe that's as far as one can go. To say that the evils we suffer are part of God's design implies that death, suffering, and destruction are somehow acceptable or justifiable, right? Because there'll be a grand design. But I think that would sound very hard and cold to someone who was suffering, to say, like, I don't know what you say, you know, it's really sad to you right now, but you shouldn't feel that way is what you're implying, because God's weaving a grand design out of this horrible thing that's happening to you right now. And the implication that God is allowing evil in order to weave a beautiful grand design seems to also raise serious questions about God's goodness and power. For example, the Holocaust is an example often used right in the context of evil. Would it make sense to say that God allowed the Holocaust because somehow God knew it could be woven into a final tapestry? Seems to me that if God, being all powerful, could have chosen otherwise, like not to allow the Holocaust, it would be hard to imagine how a God who did allow it, right, who could have disallowed it, is really good. Would a good God need to weave the Holocaust into the grand design? So there's some ways that it just doesn't quite make sense. One of the things you might notice here is that in the face of evil, the more we want to emphasize God's power or control, as most of these examples do, the more we call into question God's goodness. And that's just the nature of the dilemma, right? If evil is real and God is good, then if evil is real and we emphasize that God's in total control, like, does that make sense? A God in total control who allows all this evil doesn't really appear to be good. And so that critique could apply to virtually all of the categories that we've looked at so far, 3 categories. So the fourth category, fourth set of comfort phrases, and I'm zipping through this probably too quickly here, but fourth category of comfort phrases says something like this. These all sound very familiar too, I'm sure. Whatever's meant to be will always work out perfectly. Well, again, was that event meant to be? Does everything always work out perfectly? Right? So comfort phrases already somewhat problematic. If God brings you to it, God will bring you through it. Another common comfort phrase that I've heard many times. God is closing a door, but God is also opening a window. If God gives you lemons, make lemonade. God never gives us more than we can handle, which I think is meant to say, you'll get through this. Or life is 10% what happens to you and 90% of how you react to it, which is kind of encouragement to react well. So how does this category, this final category we're going to look at, how does this category of comfort phrases resolve the logical dilemma? I don't think they do resolve the dilemma. I don't even think they're meant to resolve the dilemma. I think they set the dilemma aside, right? It might still be there, but I want to offer you words of encouragement in the midst of your suffering. So they're kind of encouraging, or if you hear them that way. They're, I think, always intended to be encouraging if you speak them. They, however, do seem to contribute to the dilemma itself. For example, if God brings you to it, God will bring you through it. If God brings you to it, implies that God is the one to blame for the suffering that you now need to go through. Right? Does God bring you to it? Or did it happen for some other reason where God wasn't part of the causal force? God never gives us more than we can handle, clearly says that it is God who is giving us whatever it is that we now need to handle. Like God's giving us the suffering. But that's okay because God knows we'll be able to handle it. Of course, people don't always handle suffering well, do they? And sometimes handle it just means a relative who's dying of pancreatic cancer. Handling it probably just means living in, he described his life as almost total misery now, right? Living in misery until he dies. So maybe you can handle that, but I'm not sure what that means in that context. So these examples of comfort phrases, I think, are sometimes heard by the person who suffers in ways that sound cold and uncaring. Like I might say, I'm already mad at God, and now you're reminding me that it's God who actually gave me this terrible suffering that I'm supposed to get through. I'd rather hear that God wasn't to blame and God doesn't want me to be suffering in this way. Like that would seem to make God good, right? If God's the one giving it to me, that sort of implies God's power instead. Okay, so if that wasn't enough, I have a summary of some other critiques of comfort phrases, 5 of them. And then I might say a little bit about the free will response. So I think a more honest and defensible response would be to say, evil and suffering is a mystery, and we can't explain it, or we can't explain it away. It's just a mystery. And if you say that, you can't then go on to use a comfort phrase which tries to explain it away. You just have to acknowledge it's a mystery. And it's a mystery I have to live with. And I have a set of questions to ask you if you want to discuss things, or instead of asking me questions. And one of the questions asks, would that work for you to say, I'm troubled by the problem of evil, but I guess it's just a mystery, and leave it there? I think some people might be okay with that. Some people want it to be more meaningful, right? And we're not okay with a mystery. We want to figure it out. It's also, secondly, and this Dorothea Zola, in her wonderful book, Suffering, that's the title, Suffering, says it's only the privileged who are not suffering who are in a position to justify evil, and they justify it with sentences they have not thought through and do not understand. She's talking about comfort phrases here, sentences people use that they haven't really thought through, and they don't really understand what they're saying when they use those words. She says to say that everything is God's will is to say that we are powerless to intervene on behalf of those who suffer. In fact, if it's God's will, shouldn't I just let it happen? Like if someone's dying of cancer and I could give them chemotherapy, am I interfering with what God's trying to do, which might be to take their life? So if it's important to intervene and stop suffering, it's probably also important not to say that God's the one who's actually causing it. Most comfort phrases solve the dilemma by eliminating the third proposition, as I've tried to show. Eliminates the proposition that there's evil. The phrases deny the terrible reality of evil And why do they do this? In order to defend God's goodness and power, right? If you're just limited to the dilemma, and you have to get rid of the dilemma somehow, and you do it by eliminating evil exists, then God's power and goodness are maintained. Many comfort phrases also, I think, distance the speaker from the person who suffers. Right? And I think some of my explanations and critiques have shown how that might be the case. That's, again, I don't think that's the goal of anyone who uses a comfort phrase. And I'm sure if you probably recognize, if you've used some of these comfort phrases, your goal wasn't to distance yourself, but your goal was to help somebody feel better about it. So distancing is an unintended consequence. Again, another drawing on something in Dorothy Zola's book. She says, though these are my words, my summary, our only goal when we encounter people who are suffering should be to abolish the circumstances that cause the suffering. Like, it shouldn't be to justify it. It should be to abolish the circumstances, to try to eliminate their suffering in whatever way we can. When we refuse comfort phrases, we ally ourselves with a sufferer. Right? And that's what's important, right? To say, I'm with you in this, rather than to use a comfort phrase that somehow tries to justify what you're going through. And where am I? Okay, so we'll leave those there. That's what we'll get to. I think given the time, I have a little bit of time to just talk about one other topic here, because I'm sure some of you have already thought of it. Isn't evil caused by free will? Doesn't that sort of solve things? And so maybe it does. For some people, it does. There are a lot of advocates of the free will response. And I'll be mentioning it next session in a slightly different context, because if there's free will, for example, it kind of creates space. Like, is God all powerful? Maybe not, if God's kind of created space for us to use our free will, right, to act. So we'll get to that next week. But just in terms of how it's meant to solve the dilemma. Let's see. So first of all, the free will argument applies to moral evil, but not to natural evil, right? If you a really successful free will argument could leave someone saying, yeah, but what about hurricanes? Like, people didn't choose to cause hurricanes. So it only solves half of the problem of evil. Okay, the first thing, the first part of this is a very, very brief summary of, right, there are many, many books written about this. The free will response says God's not to blame for evil because of free will. It's humans who cause evil. So it kind of gets God off the hook now. Like, God's good, God's all powerful, and evil exists because humans have free will and they can cause it. Now, that doesn't totally work, but that's how it's meant to work. Humans hurt other people in a whole variety of ways. I mean, just take a whole list of crimes, right? Are all kinds of ways people hurt people. Humans create social systems that oppress people. Humans create systems that enslave people, that kill people in wars, that deprive people of basic necessities. So a lot of big evils, right, are caused by human free will. And I think that's just, I don't think you can argue with that. Humans do cause a lot of tragedy and suffering. The free will response then says we shouldn't blame God for the evil that are the actions of people. God didn't create slavery. God didn't mastermind the Holocaust. God doesn't commit physical or sexual violence. People choose to do these things, right? Which is a way to preserve the fact that God is good. It doesn't quite preserve God's all-powerful, again, because it creates a space for people to have some power and God to sort of stand back and let that happen. But that critique that I just voiced is often responded to in this way. It implies perhaps that God shouldn't have created people with free will, right? If God is all-knowing, God might have been able to foresee the fact that to give people free will would result in a huge mess. And maybe humans were a defective product and there should have been a recall. And God should have tried again, right? And done it better so that humans wouldn't cause so much suffering. So if God did that, what would the other option be? And again, a lot of people who argue in defense of free will would say God had to give us free will. I mean, otherwise we'd just be kind of automatons, pre-programmed robots. It's our capacity to make free will decisions that is essential, an essential part of what makes us human. So, for example, free will makes love possible. If I say, I love you, and you say, why do you love me? Well, I was programmed to love you. Like, that's not love, is it? So something as essential as love in the human life requires freedom to love. And so God appears not to have created the best of all possible worlds, but the common argument in response is, yes, this is the best of all possible worlds. And again, there's lots of literature to make that plain. So whether or not the free will argument resolves the problem of evil seems questionable to me. It doesn't help me very much because it seems there are a lot of flaws involved in it. But it's a very common response by sometimes brilliant philosophers, right, who write books I can hardly understand about why the free will response works. So again, we'll briefly revisit the free will response next time when we talk about the question, how is God at work in the world? Like, given free will, does that change your understanding of how God's at work in the world? And next class session is going to make some suggestions about how God's at work in the world that might reduce the problem of evil a bit, but it might do so in ways that many of you might also find problematic. So I always like to do presentations that make people think rather than just tell you what you already think, like what's the point of that? So, okay, so we have about, I have a meeting that I'm supposed to be at 11 o'clock, but I'm supposed to be here at 11 o'clock. If we end up running out of questions at 5 to 11, I'm gonna have to scoot out. So I wouldn't normally want to do that because usually even after a half an hour of questions, a couple people want to come up and talk to you individually. You want to do that, try to save it for next time because I'm the healthcare ethics consultant at Freedom Village, and there'll be a group of about 12 people waiting for me to get there. So, okay, so two ways we can proceed for the next half hour. I'm going to leave these questions here. If someone wants to respond to any one of them at any point, that sounds like a good thing to me. For example, maybe there was an event in your life that caused you to grapple with a problem of evil that you'd like to mention, because in this context, it'd be helpful to think about that or to see how some of what I said applies. Or maybe there's a comfort phrase that you really find helpful and intend to keep using, and you want to explain why. So tell us what that is and explain why. And I'm not going to argue with you and tell you shouldn't. You're just going to listen to what you have to say because you've already heard what I have to say. Or maybe someone shared a comfort phrase with you when you were suffering a tragedy and you found that really helpful. Well, go ahead and tell us about that and why you found it helpful. So I'm trying to invite comments that might disagree at least with some of what I was pushing against. And if you agree that the dilemma can't be solved, does it make sense to simply ignore it and not let it disturb your faith if you come from the Christian tradition? Or is it just something you find virtually impossible to ignore? Right. So you can answer, you can respond to any one of those at any time, or you can just make any comment or ask any question you'd like to. And the hand's already up in the back. We have a microphone on each side of the room. Yeah, so.
I have been guilty in the past of rendering or giving or stating comfort phrases and regret it to this day. They're injurious to the person that's suffering, I think. And a better thing, like you said, would be to be present and then later on ask instead of tell. And I think Forrest Gump sums it up best. The one who's dying, Forrest didn't say, "It's your time, Mom." He said, "Mama, why are you dying?" And she said, "It's just my time, Forrest." And I think Forrest Gump's got a lesson for us there in to ask, not tell.
Thank you.
Hi, this is a very timely reminder. My husband and I volunteer with an organization called Hope Force International. And so we go to natural disasters, and I'm on standby to go to Jamaica, which right now would definitely come under that category of evil. We are absolutely trained not to use these comfort phrases. The people are already asking, why has God let this happen to me? And for you to go in and say, well, it's going to make you better. It's going to make you stronger. It's such a good thing. It's okay. You're going to look back. It's just, you just can't say that. So we call it the ministry of presence. And you use that word presence. That what we do is we come alongside people and help them as we can through these very difficult situations. But we certainly don't use these awful phrases. They just make me shudder just hearing you talk about them.
So if someone asks you very directly, why did God allow this? Have you been taught some responses to make?
And basically to reply with humility, we really just don't understand.
Okay.
It's too big for us.
Okay. So there's good examples for the rest of us. I don't understand. Right? And that's going to be a very honest response. Yes.
I have so many thoughts going on in my mind from the things that you've said. So I'm going to try and keep it to comfort phrases, because I think another comfort phrase that doesn't work is, let me know if I can do anything.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's meant to be comforting. But I don't think anyone except for your very closest intimate friends, and unless you're very different from me, that's not tons of people, will call you in the middle of the night and say, can you bring me a charger for my phone because I left it at home. So that's a useless phrase along with some of the others. But one of the things that I found comforting when my husband died was people who would tell me what he said that they will remember.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And that was very comforting to know that he not only was present in my life, but he was present in their life in a way that will carry on. And that's what I think we're meant to do with grief, which there's a grief that's evil when someone has intentionally imposed death on someone else. And then there's a grief that's part of life that in many ways needs to be embraced, even if it's too soon.
Thank you. Very helpful comments.
When my mother passed away, I have to admit, words didn't have any meaning. It was the gestures. And I have to admit, the folks who went to my mother's memorial service knew we were having something at our home afterwards. And honestly, the best thing somebody ever did for me was to bring paper towels, toilet paper, napkins, because they knew so many people would be coming to my home that we would run out. And so just those objects, those basic necessities, I knew that I could count on that person. And so, yeah, words don't matter, just simple gestures.
And that's a good example related to the last comment, like, let me know if there's anything I can do. Like, I'm already going through a lot. I don't want to have to figure out what you can do. Why don't you figure out what you can do and do it?
Exactly. Yeah.
Another comfort phrase that I've rarely used it is, I know how you feel.
Mm.
Even if the person's gone through the same tragedy you have, you don't know how they feel because their situation, their family situation, whatever, is totally different. So that's another one. Don't say, I know how you feel.
Yeah, I didn't include that because it doesn't embed a theodicy exactly, but it's very common, isn't it? And I think the common response we make is, well, actually, you don't know how I feel because you're not me. You know how you might feel if you're in my situation, but it's not you who are there, it's me. Right? So instead of saying, I know how you feel, you can ask, like, some questions and give people a chance to say how they feel. Right, which is much more therapeutic, right? Because it gives people a chance to talk about something that often you're not supposed to talk about.
The comment about remembering what someone said about your husband who's dead triggered in me a thought of Murray Keller, a Jewish friend of mine who was dying very early from pancreatic cancer. And I thanked him for something he had done for me during the residency. And he said, would you tell my family that? I want them to read that at the funeral. I did something for somebody. So there's another thought.
Yeah, when I was a pastor for 4 years, never enjoyed doing funerals. I love doing weddings and continue to do those as a Hope professor, but funerals I would much rather not do. When I went to meet with when I was going to do a funeral, I would try to go and meet with the family ahead of time. And the main thing I did is say, tell me about him, right? Tell me about her. And I think that ended up being very therapeutic because it gave people a chance to remember someone well, to share their memories, and then I could use those memories, right, in the funeral meditation. And so so I think that's an effective way to be therapeutic without using the comfort phrase. Other comments, questions over here? Oh, okay, you in a minute.
I'm a nurse, so I've been dealing with this issue for a long time. I was shocked when one of my patients, an 85-year-old lady, said, I've been going to church twice every Sunday my whole life. Why is God letting this happen to me?
Yeah.
Like, were you listening? Or what kind of church? Did you hear the Heidelberg Catechism? We're imperfect and polluted with sin and we're not in heaven yet. So we can have our own answers. What would be interesting for me, I know you're a researcher, the difference between your young students and those of us who have seen suffering. Do you see, have you noted differences? Because a lot of people don't think about it until they're in the hospital for the first time when they're 85.
Well, I always thought I had very bright students, right? And very mature students. I'm sure that wasn't, I was probably overemphasizing their brilliance and maturity. But I found my students dealing with it generally in what I would call very mature ways. And I think if you'd been a fly on the wall listening to those discussions, I don't think you would have said, oh, wait until you get older and wiser. I think I saw a lot of wisdom. Because I think there's something really basic about what it means to be in a situation of suffering. And I don't know that, 20-year-olds suffer much differently than 75-year-olds. So I don't know that I could identify a huge difference. One of the, just another quick comment, Deb, is a really well-known book about the problem of evil was written by a Jewish rabbi, Rabbi Harold Kushner, and the title of his book is When Bad Things Happen to Good People, right? And so, is it okay if bad things happen to bad people? So part of the way he identifies the problem of evil is a little bit different than my logical dilemma, although he does talk about the dilemma in the book. But I think it does sometimes just sort of make sense to us that good people shouldn't go through terrible suffering. But again, that doesn't end up making much of a difference. Yes.
Okay, isn't this whole problem of theodicy based on maybe a fallacy that God micromanages?
Mhm.
But that perhaps he's standing back and wanting to see what we're doing and hasn't read the last chapter of the mystery?
Yep, that would imply that in some way God's not in total control, right? And so we'll go there and think about that option next week, right? How is God at work in the world? Maybe God's not micromanaging the world like we sometimes think, right? Maybe there's an openness. Maybe God created the world with a kind of openness. So I think you'll hear some reflections that are directly related to that comment. So thank you.
And then just one other point. Part of the responsibility that we have in terms of the theodicy problem is that we know when we know we're going to die, how do we make it easier for the people in life? I know when my wife was diagnosed and she knew she was dying, she said, my life is greater than I could ever anticipate it. So let's have, gratitude abounds. And it made it so much easier for everybody around her.
I was a hospice chaplain part-time for a few years, and I typically would ask a hospice patient who went to visit if they'd like me to pray for them. Sometimes they weren't Christian, right? But they kind of wanted a chaplain to come visit them. So I would ask, would you like me to pray for you? One time, the lady I was talking to was in bed in a nursing home, and I asked her if she'd like me to pray for her, and she said, "Oh yes." I said, "What would you like me to pray about?" She said, "Pray that I'll die soon." So the kind of the readiness to die does make it a bit easier, right, for the people who are left behind. But the loss, right, isn't necessarily an easier. I asked her why she wanted me to pray for that, and she said, like, I have nothing left to live here for. I'm just laying in bed in this nursing home. But my husband's in heaven, and I'm looking forward to seeing him. Other question?
Yes. I have two comments. One is that I think with the comfort phrases that we're thinking we're helping, and on the surface level, that's what we think we're doing.
And what we want to do.
Correct. And I think I think there's another level to that, and that is at the subconscious level, we're really trying to help ourselves. It's not, I mean, on the surface, oh, I'm helping the other people, but I think in reality is I don't know what to say, and I'm really helping myself to get off the hook.
Yeah.
That's just a
Nope.
anyway, just a assumption. I don't have proof of that, but that's what I think. And the second thing, I've been a professor for over 40 years, and I'm finding in the last 5 to 10 years, more the younger people seem to be suffering more. Anxiety, depression, suicide. Now, maybe that was always there 20, 30, 40 years ago with my students, and they never came forward. They hit it. So I don't have an explanation. I just have an observation from my own teaching at the college level and at the graduate level that there just seems to be more suffering from the younger generation. And I don't know if you have any observations on that yourself or if other people do.
Well,
anyway.
I know the literature about college students claims that that's true, right? There is more depression, more anxiety, and I found lots of students who had gone through suffering or were experiencing suffering in really deep ways, even though they were only like 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. Are you still teaching? Or?
I'm on my way out.
Okay, so this.
I'm on my way out. I'm on my way out.
Okay, so this.
One more year. I'm
Okay, so this is a very recent observation. Yeah.
I like to say that I'm sort of piggybacking off of him, I am an educator and I always believed that life was for lessons and that we would learn these lessons. And I went through a horrible 10-year period with Lyme disease and babesiosis and brain surgery and seizures, and tuck those old tubes in my bra and go off and teach every day. And somehow I got PCR free of the Lyme disease and babesiosis. And I sat with his doctor on my examining table, and he was wonderful. He would confer with New Jersey Lyme disease clinic and for my IVs and everything. He fought through this with me, and I said, I believe that life is a lesson, and told him. He rolled out my medical chart, put a ribbon around it, handed it to me, and he says, I graduate you. He said, you've learned enough lessons. And I looked at him and I thought, that is so crazy
Wow.
to believe in that.
Yeah.
We both had a good laugh, but some of these comfort things do give you comfort until you really think about them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I really strongly agree with the idea that they often give me comfort if I use them, right? And maybe that's sometimes people's goals. Yeah.
I also want to comment on the younger generations and what's happening. I taught parent education for a lot of years, both to court-referred people in a mental health clinic who were referred for some sort of abuse, and to people. I was the assistant head of a private school in Los Angeles and director of parent education there, and people came to that. And one of the things that I have seen about parents who were responsible for the current young adults, teenagers, young adults, is the desire for them not to suffer, the desire for them not to ever fall down, the desire for them never to have to have something awful happen to them. And they wanted the school to pick up the slack. They wanted everything in the world to pick up the slack. And then technology came along, allowing them to be singular, the children, not to interact with other people except like this. And then you don't see how how your words are impacting somebody else. We know more about mental health now than we used to know. I don't know where that's going. I hate the days when I'm happy I'm retired, because I feel like I don't know where we're going and how to help them, because I don't think a lot of young people have the skills to pick themselves up when they fall down, literally or figuratively.
Up over here.
I want to speak of a recent happening to me. Last night, I drove 138 miles south to honor the caregiver for my children that I used when I was nursing practice down in that area. And I went by myself. The children are out in Indianapolis and Kyle, Texas. And I'm wondering, well, it's a fair distance, but she meant so much to me. And I thought, her kids knew me because she had 3 children that were half a century younger than mine, or half a decade younger than mine, or older than mine. And they gave so much to me and my children that I wanted to pass it on. And I found that my being there meant so much to them, that just my being there, the presence of me, was more than I could have given them in any other way.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I think I temporarily anyway solved this dilemma. And I was born and raised Catholic, but I don't practice anything that puts me in a box. I solved the dilemma for myself because I spent decades asking why and felt like I never got good answers. So in my mind, the conclusion I came to that God is not all powerful. And that actually doesn't make me feel bad, because it makes me feel like I have more agency. And I'm not just sitting here waiting for someone else or something else to do something. that I can actually do it. And that has brought me a level of peace, at least, like I said, temporarily.
Okay, thank you. There's
kind of bouncing off of all of the different comments I've been listening to. The comment to make lemonade, you know, if life gives you lemons, make lemonade. I've never used that in a quote Christian context, but I have used it in a character education context where working with kids and helping them to problem solve, to get them to problem solve. Okay, if this happens, what are some ways that you can deal with this? So, so to me, that isn't a comfort phrase, but more of a teaching of how to think about how to problem solve when you're in this particular situation.
Yeah, I think in that context, the words of encouragement, right, which could be really helpful. Like it helps someone think, oh, I guess I don't just have to focus on what's wrong. I can focus on how I can resolve it in some way. And Cindy, I think my next session will speak almost directly to what you were just saying too. Any other questions or comments or thoughts? Oh, okay.
And every time somebody says something, I think, oh, yeah, so that's one more thing going on there. I'm with you. I have for a long time not thought that faith and religion were the same thing. And I believe that my God and I were introduced when I was an infant in the hospital. My mother wasn't allowed to stay because that's how it was then. And I believe that's when my relationship with God began. Then I went to church every Sunday when I was growing up. And when I was 12, I joined the Lutheran Church. And they clearly were teaching me things that my God didn't say to me. So I've always had that issue with faith and religion not being the same. And I don't believe God. If you don't have any agency, and that goes back to this, young people don't think they have agency over their own lives. They think life is happening to them. And if you think life is happening to them, and in some ways, I think religion encourages you to believe that God is in charge of what happens to you, that not you. And I think that's a mistake. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive, that you can have agency and believe in God. Enough from me.
Should this be the last question, maybe, Steve?
Unless there's another one. No, I'll stay till 11 if necessary, because they're the meeting starts with lunch and they're going to hold my lunch for me.
Okay, I wasn't sure if I was going to say this or not, but after your comment, I will. So I had a couple terrible tragedies happen in my life, and I was at a Sunday school class soon after that. And I don't remember even what the topic was, but I walked away from that saying, I got what I deserved. No, I haven't heard anybody say that God's saying you deserve this. So you can imagine, I couldn't go on with a God like that. And the rest is a very long story, but I still know there's a God out there. But a lot of times I just say, I don't understand who he is or what he is, but I know he's there.
Yeah, if there's a vindictive God, right, who gives people what they deserve, that solves the problem of evil too, right? Because then what they deserve isn't evil, it's deserved. Looks like we have no more questions, so. Thank you for all your comments. I hope you learned some important things from each other as well. I think the quality of the comments certainly should have done that too. So I enjoyed being with you. I look forward to being here again next week.